Samuel Hawkins rode his weathered mare across the endless Montana plains, his calloused hands gripping the reins as another day of checking cattle drew to a close. The year was 1887, and life as a rancher in the Dakota Territory meant solitude, hard work, and the constant awareness that civilization was still a distant dream. His modest homestead sat like a lonely island in an ocean of grass, where the wind carried stories of both promise and peril. What Samuel didn't know as he guided his horse toward home was that within the next 24 hours, his quiet existence would transform into something that would echo through the valleys and canyons for generations to come. The setting sun painted the sky crimson when Samuel first heard the sound that would change everything. A low, pained whimper carried on the evening breeze. His horse's ears pricked forward, sensing something amiss in the natural rhythm of the wilderness. Samuel had learned long ago to trust his instincts in this unforgiving land, where danger could emerge from the most unexpected places. He dismounted carefully, his boots crunching on the dry grass as he approached a cluster of rocks near a dried creek bed. What he discovered there defied every expectation he'd held about his uneventful life on the frontier. A young Native American girl, no more than 16 years old, lay crumpled against the stones. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and a dark stain spread across her traditional beaded dress. Blood seeped from a wound in her side, and her dark eyes fluttered between consciousness and the void that threatened to claim her. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he knelt beside her, knowing that this moment would define not just her fate, but his own as well. The girl's lips moved soundlessly, forming words in a language Samuel couldn't understand, but her eyes spoke a universal language of pain and desperate hope. Without hesitation, Samuel gathered her carefully in his arms, feeling how light she seemed despite being nearly grown. Her skin burned with fever, and he knew that every second counted if she had any chance of survival. The nearest doctor was a 3-day ride to Fort Collins, but Samuel's small cabin had basic medical supplies, remnants from his late wife's nursing knowledge that might make the difference between life and death. As Samuel lifted the girl onto his horse, he couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes watched from the surrounding hills. The Dakota Territory was home to several native tribes, and tensions between settlers and indigenous peoples ran as deep as the Missouri River. Taking an injured native girl to his homestead could be seen as either an act of mercy or an act of war, depending on who was doing the watching. But Samuel had never been a man to abandon someone in need, regardless of the consequences that might follow. The ride back to his cabin stretched into an eternity of careful navigation across uneven terrain. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words that sounded like prayers or names. Samuel found himself speaking to her in gentle tones, hoping that the sound of a human voice might anchor her to this world long enough for him to help her heal. His mare seemed to sense the urgency, picking her way carefully through the darkness while Samuel cradled the injured girl against his chest. Samuel's cabin appeared like a beacon in the wilderness, its single window glowing with the warmth of the oil lamp he'd left burning. Inside, he laid the girl on his bed and set to work with the methodical precision his late wife Martha had taught him years ago. The wound was deep but clean, likely from a knife rather than a bullet, and it had missed vital organs by mere inches. As he cleaned and bandaged the injury, Samuel noticed other details about his mysterious patient that deepened the puzzle of how she'd come to be alone and hurt on his land. The girl's clothing was of exceptional quality, with intricate beadwork that spoke of high status within her tribe. Her hands were soft, unmarked by the calluses that hard labor would have created, suggesting she was no ordinary tribal member. Most intriguingly, a leather pouch hung from her neck, containing items that Samuel couldn't identify but which clearly held deep significance. Everything about her suggested importance, which made her solitary presence in the wilderness even more mysterious. Through the long night, Samuel tended to his patient as fever raged through her small frame. He cooled her brow with damp cloths and forced small amounts of water between her lips when she stirred. By dawn, her breathing had steadied and the dangerous heat of infection seemed to have broken. When the first rays of sunlight crept through his window, the girl's eyes opened fully for the first time, dark and intelligent, taking in her surroundings with careful assessment rather than fear. She spoke then, her voice weak but clear, in accented English that surprised Samuel with its precision. "You saved me," she said simply, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to his soul. "I am Ayana of the Lakota, daughter of Chief Running Bear. I was traveling with a message for the tribal council when riders attacked our party. I alone escaped, but not without cost." Her hand moved instinctively to her bandaged wound, and Samuel saw a flicker of something deeper than physical pain cross her features. The name Running Bear struck Samuel like a physical blow. Every settler in the territory knew of the powerful Lakota chief, whose influence stretched across hundreds of miles of the northern plains. Running Bear was known as a leader who could command the loyalty of multiple tribes, a man whose word could mean the difference between peace and all-out war. If this girl truly was his daughter, then Samuel had unknowingly become a player in affairs far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Ayana's presence in his cabin took on new meaning as she revealed more of her story. She had been carrying a message between tribal leaders, coordinating response to increasing encroachment by white settlers and the government's broken promises about reservation boundaries. The attack on her party hadn't been random. Someone had known about her mission and wanted to prevent that message from reaching its destination. The question that haunted both Samuel and Ayana was who had orchestrated the ambush and why they wanted to stop communication between the tribes. As Ayana's strength returned over the following hours, Samuel found himself drawn into conversations that challenged everything he thought he knew about the conflict between settlers and native peoples. She spoke of her father's efforts to find peaceful solutions, of the young warriors who pushed for violent resistance, and of the impossible position tribal leaders faced as their traditional lands disappeared beneath waves of westward expansion. Her intelligence and education surprised Samuel, who had never imagined that native children might attend schools or speak multiple languages. The day passed in a strange bubble of calm that both Samuel and Ayana recognized as temporary. They shared meals and conversation, finding common ground in their love of the harsh but beautiful landscape that surrounded them. Ayana's wound continued to heal, and she proved to be remarkably resilient, insisting on helping with small tasks around the cabin despite Samuel's protests. Yet underneath their growing rapport, both felt the tension of knowing that their time together was limited by forces beyond their control. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Ayana grew quiet and watchful, often gazing out the cabin's single window toward the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. When Samuel asked what troubled her, she spoke of traditions and responsibilities that required her to complete her mission or face consequences that went far beyond personal failure. The message she carried wasn't just important. It was critical to preventing a war that would devastate both native and settler communities across the territory. Samuel's admiration for the young woman grew throughout the day, but so did his awareness of the impossible situation they faced. Keeping her at his cabin much longer would raise questions he couldn't answer, but sending her back into the wilderness alone might mean her death if the same people who attacked her party were still hunting for her. The moral weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical burden, complicated by feelings he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Evening brought an unexpected gift in the form of Ayana's laughter as Samuel shared stories of his early days on the frontier, when he'd made every mistake a greenhorn could make and lived to tell about it. Her genuine amusement at his misadventures created a warmth in the cabin that had been missing since Martha's death 3 years earlier. For a few precious hours, the outside world and its conflicts seemed far away, replaced by simple human connection between two people who might have been friends under different circumstances. But the outside world had not forgotten them, and as full darkness settled over the Montana landscape, both Samuel and Ayana felt the change in the air that signaled approaching riders. The horses came silently, their hoofbeats muffled by riders who knew how to move unseen across the plains. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, while Ayana pressed herself against the cabin wall beside the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains at the shapes moving in the moonlight. What they saw outside defied every assumption Samuel had made about who might come looking for Ayana. Instead of the small war party he'd expected, or even a larger group of angry warriors seeking revenge, nearly 200 mounted figures surrounded his cabin in perfect formation. They sat their horses with military precision, creating concentric circles that extended far into the darkness beyond Samuel's ability to count them accurately. At their head rode a figure whose very presence seemed to command the attention of every living thing within miles. Chief Running Bear had come for his daughter, but he had not come alone, and he had not come in anger. The massive gathering of warriors represented multiple tribes united in common cause, their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. As Samuel watched through his window, he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of the Dakota Territory. A show of force so overwhelming that it transcended simple rescue mission and entered the realm of political statement. The chief himself approached the cabin door, his footsteps measured and deliberate. When Samuel opened that door, he found himself face to face with a man whose reputation had preceded him by hundreds of miles. Running Bear stood tall and proud, his weathered features marked by wisdom earned through decades of leadership during impossible times. His traditional clothing was complemented by symbols of authority that spoke of his ability to unite disparate tribal groups under a single banner of purpose. "Samuel Hawkins," the chief said, his English clear and commanding, "I have come for my daughter, but I have also come to thank the man who showed mercy when hatred might have been easier." The formal tone carried undertones of evaluation, as if Running Bear was measuring Samuel's character through methods invisible to white understanding. Behind the chief, the assembled warriors remained motionless, creating an atmosphere of controlled power that was somehow more intimidating than outright aggression would have been. Ayanna emerged from the cabin then, walking carefully but steadily to her father's side. The reunion between father and daughter was marked by quiet dignity rather than emotional display, but Samuel could see the relief in both their faces as they confirmed each other's safety. In the moonlight, surrounded by nearly 200 mounted warriors, the scene took on an otherworldly quality that Samuel knew he would remember for the rest of his life. What happened next challenged every story Samuel had ever heard about native and settler interactions. Chief Running Bear turned to address not just Samuel, but the broader implications of what had occurred over the past day. The message Ayanna had been carrying, he explained, concerned a proposed treaty that could prevent the escalation of conflicts across the entire Northern Plains region. Her rescue by a white settler, and her safe return, had created an opportunity for communication that might otherwise have been lost to suspicion and violence. The chief's words carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate situation, touching on themes of honor, reciprocity, and the possibility of coexistence that political leaders on both sides claimed to want but rarely worked to achieve. Samuel found himself appointed as an unofficial ambassador, someone who had proven through actions rather than words that cooperation between different peoples was possible when guided by basic human decency rather than fear or prejudice. As dawn approached, the great gathering began to disperse, but not before Chief Running Bear extended an invitation that would change Samuel's life forever. The rancher was welcome to attend the Great Council where tribal leaders would discuss the treaty proposals, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who had earned the right to speak for the possibility of peace through his treatment of Ayanna during her time of greatest need. The story of Samuel Hawkins and Ayanna spread across the Dakota Territory like wildfire, becoming legend even before all the facts were known. Some versions emphasized the romance of the encounter, others focused on the political implications, but all agreed that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between two peoples who had seemed destined for perpetual conflict. The image of 200 warriors marching in formation behind a humble rancher became a symbol of hope in a time when hope seemed in dangerously short supply. Years later, long after the treaties were signed and the frontier had given way to civilization, Samuel would still remember that night when the impossible became reality. The injured girl he'd rescued had indeed been a chief's daughter, but more than that, she had been a bridge between worlds that had forgotten how to communicate with each other. Their brief time together had created ripples that spread across the landscape of American history, proving that individual acts of compassion could sometimes accomplish what politics and warfare could not. The final truth of the story lay not in the dramatic rescue or the impressive display of tribal unity, but in the simple recognition that courage often wore humble faces and that the most important battles were sometimes won not through strength of arms, but through strength of character. Samuel Hawkins had ridden out that morning as a solitary rancher checking his cattle, but he had returned home as something much more significant, a man who had chosen compassion over caution and discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of human kindness. The months that followed that extraordinary night brought changes to Samuel's life that he could never have anticipated. The Great Council convened as planned, and true to Chief Running Bear's word, Samuel found himself seated among tribal leaders whose wisdom had guided their people through generations of challenge and change. His presence there wasn't merely ceremonial. The chiefs genuinely sought his perspective as someone who had demonstrated that trust between their peoples was possible, even when political solutions seemed impossible. The treaty negotiations proved more complex than anyone had hoped, with factions on both sides pushing for terms that would have guaranteed future conflict rather than preventing it. Samuel's role evolved from observer to mediator, his cabin becoming an unofficial meeting place where native leaders and territorial officials could speak freely without the formal constraints that hampered official diplomatic channels. His kitchen table, where he had once eaten solitary meals while planning the next day's ranch work, now hosted conversations that would shape the future of the entire Northern Plains region. Ayanna recovered completely from her injuries, but the experience had changed her as much as it had changed Samuel. She became her father's most trusted advisor on matters involving white settlers, her unique perspective as someone who had experienced genuine kindness from an unexpected source proving invaluable in the delicate work of building bridges between communities. Her fluency in multiple languages and her education made her an effective translator not just of words, but of cultural concepts that often got lost in formal negotiations. The relationship that developed between Samuel and Ayanna defied easy categorization, existing somewhere between friendship, partnership, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. They corresponded regularly, sharing observations about the changing landscape of territorial politics and personal reflections on the strange journey that had brought them together. Her letters arrived with tribal messengers who had grown accustomed to the unusual sight of a white rancher receiving communications from Chief Running Bear's daughter. Samuel's neighbors initially regarded his involvement in tribal affairs with suspicion and confusion, unable to understand how a man they'd known as a simple cattle rancher had suddenly become a figure of regional political significance. Some accused him of betraying his own people, while others suggested he was being manipulated by forces he didn't fully understand. But as the benefits of improved relations became apparent, reduced tensions, safer travel routes, and opportunities for trade that benefited everyone, even his harshest critics began to acknowledge that his unconventional diplomacy was achieving results that traditional approaches had failed to deliver. The success of the initial treaty led to Samuel's involvement in additional negotiations, his reputation as an honest broker spreading to other tribal leaders and territorial officials throughout the region. His ranch became a landmark not for its cattle or its modest buildings, but as the place where seemingly impossible conversations had first taken place. Visitors arrived regularly, some seeking to understand how a chance encounter had evolved into a model for peaceful coexistence, others hoping to replicate similar successes in their own communities. Chief Running Bear visited Samuel's ranch several times over the following years, usually accompanied by small groups of tribal leaders who wanted to see for themselves the white man who had earned their chief's respect through a single act of compassion. These visits became celebrations of sorts, with Samuel learning to prepare meals that honored both his own traditions and those of his guests. The sight of native leaders and a white rancher sharing food and conversation around Samuel's fireplace became a powerful symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. Ayanna's visits were more frequent and more personal, often arriving without formal announcement to spend a few days helping with ranch work while discussing the complex challenges facing both their communities. She proved surprisingly skilled at cattle handling and ranch maintenance, bringing techniques from her own people's horse culture that improved Samuel's operations in ways he hadn't expected. Their working partnership deepened their friendship and created a comfortable intimacy that transcended the cultural boundaries that might have kept them apart under different circumstances. The letters they exchanged during her absences revealed the depth of connection that had developed between them, moving far beyond the gratitude and respect that had marked their initial interactions. Samuel found himself sharing thoughts and feelings that he hadn't expressed to anyone since Martha's death, while Ayanna confided her own struggles with the expectations placed upon her as a chief's daughter during a time of unprecedented change. Their correspondence became a record of two people discovering that love could indeed bridge any divide when it was rooted in genuine respect and shared values. The proposal, when it finally came, surprised no one who had witnessed the evolution of their relationship, though it challenged conventions on both sides of the cultural divide. Samuel's request for Iana's hand in marriage required delicate negotiations with Chief Running Bear, not because of opposition to the union, but because of the complex political implications such a marriage would carry. The ceremony that eventually took place honored traditions from both cultures, creating new rituals that celebrated unity while respecting the distinct heritage each partner brought to their union. Their marriage became more than a personal celebration. It represented the culmination of the bridge building that had begun with Samuel's decision to rescue an injured girl on a Montana plain. The wedding guests included tribal leaders, territorial officials, neighboring ranchers, and representatives from communities across the northern plains who had benefited from the peaceful relations that Samuel and Iana's partnership had helped to foster. The event was covered by newspapers throughout the territory, with some writers calling it the wedding of the century for its symbolic significance in regional politics. The years that followed brought children to Samuel and Iana's household, youngsters who grew up speaking multiple languages and learning traditions from both sides of their heritage. Their ranch became a model for integrated communities, employing both native and white workers in partnerships that proved profitable for everyone involved. The success of their operation inspired similar experiments throughout the region, gradually creating a network of businesses and communities that demonstrated the practical benefits of cooperation over conflict. Samuel's transformation from solitary rancher to regional peacemaker became a story told around campfires and in schoolhouses throughout the territory, inspiring others to look beyond surface differences and recognize the common humanity that connected all people. His decision to help an injured stranger had rippled outward through time and space, creating changes that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first heard Iana's cries for help on that windswept plain. The final chapter of Samuel's remarkable story came decades later, when he was an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried the best of both cultures in their hearts. The Dakota Territory had become states, the frontier had given way to cities and farms, and the conflicts that had once seemed insurmountable had been resolved through the kind of patient dialogue that Samuel and Iana had pioneered. On his deathbed, surrounded by family members whose very existence proved that love could transcend any boundary, Samuel reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of human kindness. The story of the poor rancher who carried an injured native girl on his horse, only to find 200 warriors marching behind him the next day, became more than local legend. It became a testament to the power of individual choices to change the course of history. In choosing compassion over caution, mercy over suspicion, Samuel Hawkins had not only saved one young woman's life, but had opened a door to understanding that transformed an entire region. His legacy lived on in the peaceful communities that dotted the landscape where conflict had once seemed inevitable, and in the countless lives that had been enriched by his decision to see the humanity in a stranger rather than the differences that might have kept them apart. The true measure of Samuel's impact wasn't found in the treaties that bore his influence or the political changes he had helped to facilitate, but in the simple fact that when he died, he was mourned equally by people from all the communities he had served to unite. His funeral drew mourners from hundreds of miles away, native and white alike, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair.